Autumn settled over the French bocage with a damp, metallic chill, the kind that clung to uniforms and made canvas shiver in the wind. On a narrow ribbon of road, a line of trucks slid through the darkness with their lights pinched down to sly green slits, cat eyes, that barely sketched the shoulder's edge. From a distance, you could mistake them for fireflies drifting low over the hedgerows. Up close, you could hear the breath of war, engines working hard, gears muttering under weight, brake drums ticking, load straps humming against wooden stakes. This was the Red Ball Express, a convoy of necessity, speed, and nerve, threading through a country still bristling with danger. Lieutenant Charles Wico rode in one of the lead trucks, trying to read the road by feel, the way the steering wheel trembled when they drifted toward a rut or the soft give of earth that meant the gravel crown had ended and the ditch was stalking the tires. The convoy had its rhythm, a lead jeep up front with a small blue pennant that flicked in the slipstream, a tail jeep behind them with a green flag and a toolbox big enough to mend a locomotive, and in between an unnatural order, numbers chalked on windshields, distance kept as if by metronome, the whole string tugging itself forward by will and gasoline. The trucks looked like beasts of burden that forgot to complain, canvas-backed GMCs, deuce-and-a-halfs, stacked high with jerrycans, ammunition cases, rations, and the quiet urgency of medical supplies. The first crack snapped the night like a branch breaking underfoot. Wico blinked, head cocked, listening. A second crack. Then a string of them, bright, violent, brittle. For a heartbeat he pictured a civilian throwing stones at corrugated tin, some old shed collapsing in the wind. It was a memory, not a thought, because the truth arrived in a rush, the high, angry mosquito whine of an engine above the trees, and with it the stitched silk rip of machine gun fire drawing a bright invisible line straight down the road. Out, someone shouted, though Wico was already moving, door banging, boots thudding into the cold road. Men spilled from cabs and slid into the hedgerows, lungs knotted, faces turned down as if their helmets could press them flatter to the earth. The air took on a bitter tang as tracer fire raked the line, bullets snagging on canvas and slapping metal, a chorus of unholy hail. Tree shadows flickered like shutters. Somewhere a driver forgot himself and goosed the throttle, a truck lurched and stalled, the engine a strangled cough before silence hammered it shut. In the frantic stillness after the pass, Wico recognized the choreography they had practiced and prayed not to use: scatter wide, count heads, check for flames. A driver rolled under a truck, palm feeling the belly for fire while his buddy hissed, no light, as if words could smother sparks. The smell of hot oil came up through the grass. Farther down the line, someone grunted in pain, shrapnel, maybe a shard of windshield, then bit it back with a stubbornness that was more habit than heroism. The second pass came lower, meaner, strafing the shoulder and ditch where the men hugged the earth. Leaves shredded, dirt kicked, a tire gave out with a deep, musical thud. In the blue-black sky the fighter was only a suggestion, a phantom with teeth. It shifted its weight and was gone, swallowed by night and distance, leaving the kind of silence that rings inside your ears. One after another, heads lifted. A sergeant waved two fingers in a short arc, and men came out of the hedgerow like shadows rejoining their owners. They moved with purpose and the economy of those who had learned that panic wastes seconds and seconds, in this game, cost lives. A driver penciled a small X on a sideboard to mark a bullet strike. Another cut a torn canvas flap and tied it off with a clumsy knot. Someone checked the load straps on the truck that had stalled, then reached in, hands soft on the throttle, coaxed the engine back into the world with a low, rough purr. This was the heartbeat of the Red Ball Express: hit, scatter, gather, continue. The mission did not change because the enemy was rude enough to interrupt. The supplies had to move. Gasoline was motion, and motion was survival. Wico knew it the way everyone on that road knew it, from the military police who'd blocked every turnoff for miles to the engineers who tested bridges with tape measures and prayer, to the mechanics who could listen to an engine and tell you which bearing was learning to complain. Every gallon in those jerrycans meant another mile for a Sherman, another hour of pressure against a retreating enemy, another day closer to ending a war that had taught the world its own capacity for cruelty. They reformed the convoy with cautious haste, trucks easing back into the line, bumpers close enough to sense, far enough to brake. The lead jeeps signaled with a small tilt of a gloved hand, and the string began to roll, first like a hesitant animal, then with growing confidence. The road tightened through a stand of trees, gravel deepening under the tires, and for a moment the truck sounded like surf grinding along a stony beach. They drove dark, because light brought attention and attention meant danger. Only the cat eyes showed, small crescent smiles that held the line together and warned the man behind, "I am here, keep faith, keep distance." Ahead lay a depot, just a name on an order and a smell of oil in the air, where hands would unload boxes and cans in minutes that had taken hours to earn. From there, the fuel would leap forward again with armored columns and tank destroyers, turns marked by chalk on signboards and signals a man could read at 40 miles an hour. Patton's tanks were hungry and impatient. Rumor said he wanted them fed like old cavalry horses, often, strong, and without excuses. No one needed to confirm it. The evidence was simple: when the fuel arrived, steel moved; when it didn't, everything stopped, not because of German guns, but because logistics had failed to keep pace with victory. It was a bitter irony that everyone in the line carried without speaking. The Allies had shattered France's railways in the spring and early summer to starve the German coastal defenses before D-Day. Bridges toppled, junctions crumpled, rolling stock torn open like tin toys. It had worked. But now, as the enemy fell back faster than planners had dared predict, the wreckage remained, a chessboard overturned by the victor, and the board could not be set right in time to serve the pursuit. So the trucks were born of that paradox. They were the shortcut across a problem of our own making, the improvised artery pulsing against the limits of mud, distance, and fatigue. WWII adjusted in his seat and watched the road's pale ribbon unfurl. He knew the stories already, about drivers who used a hill's momentum like a secret weapon, about carburetors tweaked in the dark to squeeze 1 more mile per hour out of an engine, about the way French villagers learned to step back when a red ball convoy roared through, deliberate and unswerving as a train with no rails. He'd seen the green tail flag vanish around a bend and trusted it was still there. He'd seen men pour coffee from a dented thermos with fingers that could not stop trembling, take 2 sips, and then hand the cup forward without a word. On both sides of the road, the war lingered in fragments, burned-out hulks that had once been trucks like theirs, a stone wall laced with fresh shrapnel scars, a cow in a field staring at them as if it had seen this parade every night for a century and accepted it with animal patience. The air held the faint sweet note of autumn rot, the harsh tang of hot brake pads, a whiff of cigarette smoke stolen behind a cupped hand. Somewhere behind them, a medic truck drifted along like a careful ghost, because even in a supply line, blood was part of the cargo. They would make the drop if the road held and the enemy stayed bored. They would turn around and run back along the one-way loop that kept them from colliding head-on with their own necessity. They would do it again and again until the rails were mended, the ports unclogged, and the advance could eat through a better diet of logistics. Until then, the Red Ball Express would be the lungs and heart of an army sprinting faster than its body had been built to move. Another curve. Another small rise. The convoy gathered itself and pressed on, the night swallowing their edges, the road's white nerve humming under the tires. WWII listened for the engine in the sky and heard only the breathing of machines and men. He fixed his eyes on the dim lights ahead and thought, as all of them did in those hours, of the simplest equation the war had taught them: without fuel, there is no tomorrow. And tomorrow was the only direction they knew. In the first weeks after the landings, the war in Normandy moved with the stubborn pace of a plow cutting through stone. The hedgerows, those ancient earthen banks topped with tangled green, turned every field into a fortress, every lane into an ambush. Allied infantry bled forward a few hundred yards at a time, artillery battering holes, engineers blowing gaps, tank crews learning hard lessons about close-quarters fighting where a German Panzerfaust could lurk behind any leaf. By early July, the fear whispered in headquarters had a familiar, ghostly shape: trench warfare. Not in form, no endless parallel ditches from sea to Swiss border, but in spirit, a grinding stalemate that would eat men and time the way the last war had done. And then, almost at once, the line cracked. In late July, after days of planning and a storm of bombs that tore open a seam in the German defense, the Allied front lunged. What had held with elastic strength snapped back on itself. Units that had held firm under weeks of punishment began to give way, not all at once, but at the edges, then the center, like fabric unraveling where you cannot see the first cut. The Falaise pocket took shape as the jaws of Allied armies closed, and German formations, battered and confused, fought to slip away east. The battlefield shifted from attrition to pursuit, the most intoxicating, and treacherous, phase of war. On paper, the plan was clear enough. Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army would pivot west to seize the ports of Brittany, the deep water throats through which a continent's worth of supplies could be poured, while Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's forces, alongside British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, drove east, hustling the enemy across the Seine and out of France. The logic was impeccable: open ports to feed the advance, pressure everywhere to keep the retreat from coalescing into a new line, let the momentum do what months of preparation had promised. But the enemy's retreat came faster than expected. German staff work was frayed, not broken, discipline persisted even in disaster. They abandoned positions, flowed around roadblocks, used the night like a cloak, and left behind obstacles designed to slow pursuers more than to kill them. The map in Allied headquarters began to stretch, lines of advance running past the edges of the grease pencil overlays. The thrill of pursuit came tempered by a new anxiety taking root in the minds of logisticians: speed was outrunning sustenance. By late August it was not the German army that threatened to halt the advance, it was the empty space between the front line and the last solid, functioning supply base. The cruelest part of the problem was that the Allies had themselves set its conditions. In the months before D-Day, Allied air forces had executed the transportation plan, a deliberate campaign to smash the railways and bridges feeding German coastal forces. Railyards were cratered into moonscapes, tracks twisted into steel vines, locomotives gutted. It worked. German units on the coast were starved of ammunition and fuel at the moment of decision. But railroads do not heal with victory. Now, even as the enemy fell back, those broken lines remained a skeleton with missing bones. The very network the Allies might have used to feed an advance across France lay in ruins by design. Ports told a similar story of paradox. Cherbourg, once taken, proved a triumph of arms and a torment for engineers. The Germans had not left it intact, they had scuttled ships in the harbor, mined the approaches, wrecked cranes and quays. It could be repaired, and it was, but not to the capacity and speed the front now demanded. The artificial mulberry harbors, the prefabricated piers and breakwaters towed across the channel and assembled off the invasion beaches, had been a miracle of planning. One, serving the American beaches, had been torn apart by a storm only days after D-Day. The surviving British mulberry at Arromanches shouldered far more than it had been asked to bear, but even miracles come with limits. Meanwhile, the great channel ports farther north, Le Havre, Antwerp, remained either in German hands or useless so long as their approaches were blocked and their estuaries mined. Antwerp would be captured in early September but made truly usable only after its river, the Scheldt, was cleared at terrible cost. In late July and August, none of that eased the basic arithmetic. Most of what fed the Allied armies still came over the open beaches of Normandy and had to be carried, mile, by road. A pursuit is not merely an offensive that moves faster. It is a different creature, logistically carnivorous. Ammunition consumption spikes in bursts as rear guards are hammered, fuel demand surges not only because tanks and trucks move more, but because they moved farther, each mile adding friction, tires wearing, engines heating, oil thinning, mechanical failure stalking every column. Warehouses and depots, safely stacked near the coast in carefully arranged dumps, cannot move themselves. They must be pushed forward in leaps, each leap a gambler's bet on which roads will be passable, which bridges will hold, which towns can be bypassed. A system designed to feed a beachhead, a short, fat pipe with predictable flow, must suddenly become a long, flexible artery, pulsing supplies to a front that lengthens and bends daily. Staff officers felt the strain first in ledgers and estimates. How many tons to an infantry division per day if it marches 20 miles? How much more to an armored division when pursuit replaces patience? They argued over tonnage tables, penciled calculations onto blotters, and sent urgent messages to engineers. How quickly can we bridge the wire here, the dives there? Can you keep a road open under this weight of traffic without tearing it to pieces? Military police, who had been traffic cops near beaches and depots, now had to carve order out of chaos across the breadth of northern France. They set up one-way loops, forbade civilian traffic on critical stretches, and created corridors where vehicles flowed like a river that had been given banks. Behind the numbers lived the ordinary facts of a country and its wounds. Bridges had been dropped into rivers, leaving detours that doubled back like cursive. Roads pocked by bomb craters were patched with crushed stone and planks. Villages funneled convoys through streets barely wide enough for 2 carts, never mind 2 deuce-and-a-halves. Every detour multiplied distance, every mile multiplied need. On maps, logisticians drew thick arrows and thin ones, color-coded routes for outbound loads and returning empties, and hoped the ink could be enforced with enough signs, enough MPs, enough discipline. It was organization at its most fragile, because the enemy did not have to defeat it, merely delay it, to turn speed into hunger. The commanders understood the stakes even when their eyes were fixed on the enemy's back. Patton, impatient to drive his armor like a thunderstorm across the plains, did not need reminding that steel without gasoline is sculpture. Bradley and Montgomery, intent on boxing the Germans against the Seine and forcing crossings before new lines could be formed, counted days and bridges against the diminishing slack in their supply lines. The professional fear was not that the enemy would turn and fight with new strength, but that the Allied advance would simply grind to a halt with barrels dry, batteries dead, and hungry men staring at empty roadways waiting for trucks that did not arrive. Some relief flickered at the edges. Engineers brought damaged rail lines back from the dead in stretches, enough to carry a trickle here, a stream there. Cherbourg's ports breathed again, first shallow, then deeper. But these gains lagged behind the footfalls of the armies. In that gap, the space between what the front demanded today and what the infrastructure could deliver tomorrow, the solution would have to be raw, immediate, and tire-borne. Even as August burned down, the signs were unmistakable. Tank battalions rationed movement by the hour. Artillery chiefs counted shells against the likely range of tomorrow's march. Commanders began to speak in a new grammar, not just objectives and lines, but gallons and gradients, axle loads and bridge classifications. The road became the war's true front line, an invisible battlefield where delays could be as deadly as defeat. In mess tents and motor pools, a rumor hardened into certainty: if the advance was to be saved from its own success, someone would have to invent a way to make the roads behave like railroads, to make trucks move like trains without rails. That answer would arrive not as a theory but as a decision reached in the fatigue-sour air of a headquarters room where maps lay crowded with pinned notes and coffee rings. It would be bold and inelegant, a solution born of urgency rather than elegance: take every usable truck, every driver who could be spared, and build a dedicated, protected, one-way system that moved supplies forward at a pace the front could live on. It would take a name from the railroads it sought to emulate, a phrase that meant priority, speed, no excuses, and it would set in motion an artery of steel and rubber that pulsed across France day and night. By the last desperate days of August, the edge of crisis sharpened into action. The pursuit had outrun itself. Now the war would depend, for a time, on an improvised answer as audacious as the advance it sustained. The shock, when it came, was not a barrage or a counterattack. It was a silence. Tanks that had clattered forward for days sat hushed in fields and on roadside verges, their crews staring at gauges as if willing needles to rise by force of belief. The advance did not meet a wall of fire, it met a dry fuel line. Patton's Third Army and Courtney Hodges's First had been drinking gasoline at a rate that defied imagination, roughly 800,000 gallons a day between them, and in late August the arithmetic finally outpaced the bravado. Steel that could not move was only so much scenery, and an army that had outrun its fuel was a giant standing on numb legs. The geography of the problem was cruel. To the north and east, the ports that could feed an invasion at continental scale, Le Havre, Antwerp, remained in German hands or functionally useless until their approaches were cleared. Antwerp would fall in early September, but its lifeline, the Scheldt estuary, was a mined, fortified artery that would not be opened for weeks. Cherbourg, snatched earlier at high cost, was a miracle of recovery in progress, its harbor choked with scuttled hulls, its cranes toppled, its quays wrecked. Engineers worked like surgeons in a war zone, but ports heal in months, while armies hungry for momentum feed in hours. That left the beaches of Normandy, the open throat through which nearly everything American moved onto the continent, still the primary source of supply deep into the pursuit. From beach to battlefield, the path of a gallon of gasoline was a pilgrimage. Tankers and LSTs disgorged bulk fuel into temporary shore installations, hoses snaking through surf to bladders and tanks, pumps thudding under drab tarpaulins. In theory, pipelines would take over and push fuel inland. In practice, the early war-borne lines were short and fragile, more proof of concept than solution, their capacity dwarfed by need. The famed undersea Pluto pipes existed, but in mid-44 their flow was a stream against a flood. Engineers laid tactical pipelines from the beaches toward St. Lo, then farther, but a front that leaped 20 miles in a day could outrun iron buried the week before. And pipelines have their own war, they demand protection, pumping stations, valves and maintenance, and time. So the fuel was decanted into containers that people and machines could touch and move now. The humble jerrycan, 5 gallons of stamped steel genius borrowed from a German design, became the coin of the realm. It was stackable, rugged, and handled by 2 men in a hurry or 1 man with a strong back and bad judgment. Beside it, the 55-gallon drum stood like a stubborn relative, efficient when you had forklifts and good roads, a curse when you did not. Drums rolled, leaked, and demanded cranes. Jerrycans could be handed down a line like buckets at a barn fire, fitted into every spare rectangle of a truck bed, and poured into a Sherman's thirsting mouth without a prayer to the gods of heavy equipment. But even genius multiplied by desperation has limits. Every can moved by hand multiplied labor, and every transfer from bulk to container to tank invited spillage, loss, and fatigue. Fuel's journey was not lonely. Rations, medical supplies, spare parts, artillery shells, each had its own math and its own appetite. Yet gasoline defined the tempo. An infantry division might need something like 150 tons of gasoline per day during sustained movement, an armored division, more than double that, 350 tons, just to keep its tracks and trucks turning. Consider the machine at the sharp end. A Sherman tank often drank fuel at less than 2 miles per gallon, and it did not sip at idle. Every reconnaissance sweep, every flanking movement, every hour of engines kept hot for a sudden push burned what could not be easily replaced. The advance had changed character from a scheduled march to a chase. In a chase, you do not conserve, you spend to buy time. Time, in late summer 1944, had become the most precious thing in Europe. Across the lines, the German army still moved in a past that gnawed at its future. Horse-drawn wagons hauled shells and bread. Entire divisions relied on flesh and patience where rubber and gasoline should have been. It slowed them, yes, but it also made their logistics strangely resilient. Horses do not need refined fuel, they can pass where a truck cannot, and they do not burst into flames under strafing. The paradox sharpened the Allied dilemma: mobility had to be fed without interruption to keep pressure on an enemy that could, if given a day's slack, gather itself on a river line and turn pursuit into siege. Mobility was a blade that dulled instantly when it lacked oil. Staff officers who lived in the world of tables and maps felt the crisis as a creeping misalignment between plan and reality. Beach dumps, neat stacks of fuel, food, and munitions under canvas, guarded against theft and storm, were safe but far. Forward dumps, improvised in orchards and fields near St. Lo and beyond, were only as useful as the trucks that fed them and the routes that stayed open under the weight of 1,000 tires. The distances multiplied. A truck that could make 3 round trips in a day at the beachhead could make 1, then none, as the line extended east. Every extra mile was a tax on capacity, collected in hours, parts, and sweat. This is why the phrase, distribution system, mattered more than it sounded. It was not enough to have fuel somewhere in Normandy. It had to exist in the right places, in the right containers, at the right times, with a plan for the last tactical mile, down to the company trains and the sergeant who decided whether a reconnaissance platoon got enough gas to probe the next crossroads before dusk. In the language of doctrine, pursuit logistics demands echelon supply, leapfrog depots, traffic discipline, and command priorities that tell you who gets fed first when there isn't enough for all. In the language of men on the ground, it meant one cold fact: if the trucks didn't arrive tonight, tomorrow died. The Allies knew other modes could help, eventually. Rail lines, patched like old quilts, began to carry modest loads where bridges could be thrown across gaps and locomotives coaxed back to life. Barges crept along canals where locks hadn't been blown. But none of these could be scaled instantly. The only asset that could be multiplied today, this hour, was the wheeled tonnage already in theater: trucks of every shape, spare drivers from every unit, traffic policemen with white gloves and iron wills, engineers with Bailey bridges and bulldozers to bully roads into compliance. If that sounds inelegant, it was. But war bends to what works, not what looks good on a planning board. A truck was a small, forgiving miracle. It did not need a schedule or a timetable, it needed a route, a driver, and fuel to carry fuel. It could detour around a crater, ford a shallow ditch, and wait silently on a roadside while enemy planes hunted elsewhere. Multiply that by thousands, give it right-of-way across a country, feed it with mechanics and spare parts and strict rules, and you could create a river where no river flowed. The one constraint that could not be finessed was weight on wheels versus miles of pavement. The roads could carry only so much before they tore themselves apart under the stress, and that meant order would decide whether the system fed the front or devoured itself in jams and breakdown. By late August, the proof had arrived: in stalled columns and anxious reports. The armies had reached the edge of what the existing supply web could push forward. The big ports would come online, the rails would hum again, the pipelines would throb with steady pressure, but not in time to preserve the pursuit's momentum. The fix had to be immediate, disciplined, and large. It had to turn the entire road network into a single-purpose instrument tuned to one note: forward. Commanders called it simple and savage in its clarity. Strip non-essential units of trucks. Reassign men to drive whether they had driven before or not. Lay out one-way arteries from the beaches and near-coast depots to forward dumps close enough to the fight that you could hear it. Ban everything else from those roads. Mark convoys, mark vehicles, mark the air with flags. Make the road behave like a railroad, and make the railroad's old phrase your promise: priority, speed, no excuses. When the order came, it did not announce elegance. It promised motion. It said, in effect, we will feed the front with wheels until the ports and rails are ready to take over. And until that day arrives, we will not stop to admire our plan, we will drive it. The order was born in a room that smelled of damp maps, hot coffee, and sleepless resolve. Brigadier General Ewart G. Plank stood over a table rimmed with grease pencil circles and pinned notes, the nervous system of a war pulsing through colored string. For 36 hours he and his staff argued with arithmetic, tonnage, gradients, axle loads, and bullied it into obedience. The conclusion was crude and elegant at once: if rails were broken and ports not yet breathing, then the road would become the railroad. Every truck that could move would move one thing: supplies forward, and nothing would be allowed to stand in its way. Someone wrote the name on a notepad as if it had always been waiting there: Red Ball, railroad slang for freight that moved with absolute priority, a phrase that once flashed across dispatch boards in American yards and had already been borrowed for a smaller British-run effort feeding English ports in the invasion's early days. Now it would become something larger, an artery stretched tight across France. Plank's intent was a promise as much as a plan. Let it never be said that, a lack of supplies, stopped Patton when the Germans couldn't. The line moved through the staff like a lit fuse. Phones rang out across the theater. Orders leapt from headquarters to depots, from depots to motor pools: strip every non-critical unit of trucks, reassign soldiers as drivers, assemble provisional companies from whatever wheels and hands could be found. Neat organizations dissolved into function, transport above all. Within hours, quartermasters in canvas offices were writing requisitions as if they were battle orders. If it had a bed and an engine, it had a destiny. To make the thing breathe, Plank reached for a man who understood velocity as a creed. Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayres had earned the nickname Little Patton for the way he drove problems until they moved. He arrived at the nerve center with dust on his boots and a list already forming in his head: trucks, drivers, mechanics, MPs, engineers, signalmen, fuel for the fuel carriers, food for the men who would not step away from the wheel long enough to eat properly. His first move was not a speech but a scavenger hunt at scale. He sent officers with clipboards and the moral authority of crisis to comb the theater. In England, in Brittany, along the hedgerow lanes and in rear area parks, trucks were counted, checked, and claimed. Companies that had been hoarding a few extras for, just in case, watched their margins evaporate. The priority was not subtle. It was printed on orders and spoken with the voice of the theater commander: the road is a bloodstream now, and you are a red cell in it. The backbone was the GMC CCKW, known with a mixture of affection and exasperation as the Deuce and a Half. Its official rating was 2.5 tons cross-country, but on pavement it could shoulder 5, a quiet confession of its overbuilt heart. Canvas-backed, with wooden stakes and side racks, the CCKW did not look heroic. It looked inevitable. Its inline six growled without drama, its axles took abuse like old prizefighters, its winch could save the day for itself and its neighbors. Around it clustered a supporting cast, Diamond TS and Max hauling heavier loads, Dodges and Chevrolets darting as utility runners, wreckers with booms like skeletal arms. But the Jimmy, as soldiers called the CCKW, was the workhorse that would carry most of the war's weight one reluctantly glorious mile at a time. America's factories had made this possible long before a single convoy rolled. On assembly lines in Detroit, St. Louis, and 100 towns in between, presses and welders had produced trucks by the millions, over 2 million across the war, so many that they seemed to appear the moment you needed them, like a magician's handkerchiefs pulled from an empty fist. Crates the size of sheds had crossed the Atlantic in Liberty ships, each filled with parts that could be married into an engine or an axle, each a promise to outrun scarcity. The Red Ball took that industrial abundance and gave it a single direction. Provisional truck companies bloomed overnight like field hospitals. Some were skeletons fleshed out with men pulled from bakeries, signal posts, and clerks' tents, soldiers who knew a typewriter better than a clutch pedal on Monday and could double-clutch a 5-speed by Thursday out of self-preservation. In tent classrooms that smelled of canvas and chalk dust, sergeants taught the catechism of motion, how to check oil by sound and feel when light was forbidden, how to feather a throttle with a full load on a hill without burning a clutch to cinders, how to read hand signals at night, how to live in a cab with another man and a thermos of coffee for 16 hours. The Transportation Corps printed pamphlets that already felt old by the time the ink dried. The road itself would be the real instructor, offering merciless pass/fail exams. Every artery needs valves and guardians. Military police were the system's white blood cells, posted at intersections and choke points, gloved hands slicing the air to keep the flow pure. They were given authority that brooked no appeal. On red ball routes, convoys had right-of-way over everything. Engineers became the quiet heroes in the margins, measuring bridge load limits with slide rules and experience, throwing Bailey bridges across streams with a speed that seemed like sleight of hand, grading shoulders and packing gravel where 1,000 tires had turned dust to flour. Ordnance units set up forward repair points that looked like junkyards at first glance and miracles at second, where a truck could limp in with a broken heart and leave beating again after an hour of cannibalization and curses. They called it robbing Peter to pay Paul, and did it with surgical precision, building one reliable rig out of two tired ones because the convoy did not care about symmetry, it cared about motion. Signalsmen hung wire along stretches of critical road and set up field telephones in canvas shacks so a jam could be sensed and bled before it killed the route. At depots near St. Lo and beyond, quartermaster troops stacked jerrycans like bricks in a cathedral, ready for the moment when a convoy's tailgate dropped and the human chain snapped into life. Fuel officers learned to speak a new dialect of urgency, counting not just gallons but minutes, matching loads to needs with a gambler's nerve. Somewhere in every node stood a corporal with a clipboard whose neat columns masked chaos. His job was to feed the beast with the precision of a metronome while the world around him shouted. There was no time to make it pretty. Paint peeled from fenders, stencils were crooked, serial numbers vanished under dust. Trucks were marked quickly with convoy identifiers and chalk, their positions in line scrawled on windshields and sideboards. The famous red circle signs, simple, bold, undeniable, went up along the designated roads to warn off anyone who might wander into the stream. Drivers learned that those circles were not suggestions, they were laws of physics. This stretch of France now belonged to a single purpose: take what the ships and beaches had given and hurl it forward as if the front were a magnet and the loads were iron filings. In all of this there was a sense of theft from the ordinary world. French civilians watched as columns that never stopped became the country's new weather, a tide that rose and fell by day and night. Units not attached to the system learned to live without their extra trucks, or to borrow and barter around the edges. The black market sniffed, circled, and was beaten back by discipline and the knowledge that stealing from a red ball load was stealing a soldier's tomorrow. The system behaved like a new organism grafted onto the old army, its nerves hot, its heartbeat fast. By the time Ayres took his first breath and looked up from the whirlwind he had conjured, the Red Ball Express existed, not as an idea, but as motion you could hear on the wind. In forward areas, men began to talk about the sound as if it were a weather report, the low, steady rush of engines that meant the artery was open and the patient would live another day. Behind them, in coastal dumps, empty pallets and flattened fuel bladders told their own story. The beast was feeding, and it was hungry enough to justify every indignity inflicted on neat tables of organization. There would be rules, and routes, and rituals to keep this improvised miracle from collapsing under its own weight. But those belonged to the next chapter. For now, the victory was simple. In a theater that had run up against the hard limit of its own success, men with clipboards, wrenches, sidearms, and nerve had taken steel and rubber and made a promise to the future. The road would carry the war forward, come what may. The first signs appeared like warnings from another world, round boards splashed with a bold red circle nailed to trees, hammered into verges, fixed to shattered stone walls where crossroads still stood. They were simple, unmistakable, and absolute. Where those circles pointed, the countryside's ordinary life ended and the Red Ball's circulation began. Military police in white helmets took their posts under them like sentries at the gates of an artery, palms up to halt anything that did not belong, 2 fingers flicking convoys through with the economy of men who had turned traffic into a weapon. The route itself was a piece of enforced geometry on a map that resisted order. From the supply depots near Saint-Lô eastward to La Coupe, on the outskirts of Paris, planners drew a loop, 2 veins running in opposite directions, because French roads, choked and narrow, could not endure two-way chaos under so much weight. Loaded convoys took one road, returning empties and service vehicles took another. Northbound stretches were reserved for trucks heavy with gasoline, ammunition, rations, and medical tins, so there would be no head-on panic, no stalled exchanges on bridges that could barely bear their burdens. Even the shoulder belonged to the plan, vehicles would hug the crown and hold their place, not drift, not improvise, not tempt fate. 2 highways stretching from the Normandy beachhead to Chartres, an ancient city whose cathedral spires could be seen from miles away, were set aside exclusively for the convoys. At the edge of each protected corridor, MPs raised wooden barriers, posted orders in English and French, and turned back civilian carts, wandering motorcyclists, even Allied staff cars that thought themselves above the new law. The roads belonged to a single purpose now, and every minute they were free of interruption translated directly into distance covered, gallons delivered, lives supported. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps wrote rules with a stenographer's speed and an engineer's logic. No convoy would run with fewer than 5 trucks, and each truck wore its position like a badge, numbers chalked on windshields and sideboards so a lead driver could glance in his mirror and know who had fallen away. Spacing was mandatory, 60 feet between vehicles as if measured by a sixth sense, an interval long enough to keep dust manageable and braking distances sane, short enough to maintain the integrity of the column under blackout. The speed limit was 25 miles per hour, not a suggestion, but a cap forged by physics, visibility, and the fragile patience of wooden bridges. Drivers learned the cadence of it in their bones, the way 25 felt with a full bed and low gears, the hum of tires on broken macadam, the subtle slide that meant rain had made pudding of the road. This discipline had a purpose beyond neatness. In daylight, tight spacing reduced the accordion effect that collapsed convoys into jams at the first hill or choked intersection. At night, it kept the cat eyes, those dim green slits, visible enough to stitch the line together without revealing it to an enemy sky. On bridges, it meant only 1 truck at a time, no exceptions, axles centered, eyes forward, a clerk with a clipboard and a stopwatch counting each crossing so the weight never compounded into catastrophe. Engineers posted their bridge classifications in painted circles that looked like speed limits to the uninitiated. They were not suggestions either, they were the last word against physics. When a bridge's rating was insulted by the loads demanded of it, a Bailey bridge arrived like a magician's trick, assembled from steel panels and pins by crews who could turn a river crossing from a liability into a fact in a single working day. Along the loop, the military built valves and service bays in the open air. Control points, just a tent, a table, a clock, and men who lived by it, broke the route into segments. Convoys checked in, had their times logged, and were waved on or slowed to ease a clot forming miles ahead. MPs on motorcycles prowled like shepherds, looking for stragglers, nudging speeders down to sanity with a flat hand push motion, handing citations to those who mistook the road for a racetrack. Recovery teams lurked like angels in grease-stained coveralls at prearranged laybys, wreckers with swiveling booms ready to pluck a broken truck from the line as delicately as a surgeon lifting a shard of glass from a wound. No one wanted heroics at mile marker 12, heroics slowed the flow. Order was the only bravery the road required. Fuel and repair nodes punctuated the arteries at rational intervals. At some, a convoy could peel into a layover lane, engines idling while men passed jerrycans hand to hand like buckets at a barn fire, topping off tanks in minutes rather than hours. Grease points and quick change pits were nothing more than tarps thrown on dirt where a mechanic could slide under a truck, wrenching at a bolt that had begun to sing the wrong note. Air compressors thumped away, inflating tires that had been bitten thin by pothole edges. A small team with a box of carburetor parts could retune a fussy engine in the time it took a driver to swallow cold coffee and 3 crackers. The convoys wore their hierarchy in flags and gestures. A lead jeep with a blue pennant took point, a green-flagged cleanup jeep brought up the rear with a crate of tools, a tow chain, and an optimism 1 part confidence, 1 part denial. The trucks in between were a numbered family, each knowing its place. If number 7 disappeared, number 6 would slow and raise a gloved hand in a circling motion, the signal passing forward until the lead jeep eased the whole column down to a crawl. If the gap closed too much, a flat palm dropped, then waved out and down to spread the line like a fan. At night, horns were forbidden except for emergency, 3 short taps for halt, 1 long for danger, but men learned the language of engine notes and brake squeals, and of shadows moving in the narrow cone of permissible light. French civilians learned the rules almost as quickly. A cart pulled briskly into a field as a convoy approached, a bicycle was walked against a stone wall, children with V-signs and curious dogs were hauled back by mothers standing in doorways. In some towns, the red ball's route bent aside to skirt the squares and bridges that could not bear its mass. In others, MPs stood in the middle of streets like pillars while the sea of vehicles parted around them, a ritual that repeated day after day until it felt older than the war itself. The red circle signs became part of the civic landscape, warnings, omens, and reassurances all at once. Where they stood, the army's appetite had found a safe passage. All of it, the signs, the loop, the rules, was designed to fight the enemy called friction. Friction lived in the swerve of a curious car, the hesitation at a narrow bend, the temptation to pass on a hill, the extra minute a driver lingered to smoke and stretch because he had forgotten that his comfort cost a mile of movement at the front. The Transportation Corps wrote its commandments to beat that enemy back: no unauthorized halts, no passing within the column except by order, no deviation from route, no stopping for damaged vehicles except the cleanup crew. It felt draconian until you looked at the ledger. Each minute stolen from the road stole 4 miles from a tank's tomorrow. The loop from St. Lo to La Coupe did more than carry supplies, it taught an army how to think in lanes and flows. It turned a countryside of hedgerows and lanes into a predictable machine whose parts could be timed, measured, and improved. Men who had once been infantry or clerks learned to live by intervals and tons. MPs became priests of a liturgy in which the red circle was a host and the white glove a benediction. Engineers, ordnance, and signalmen became the road's immune system, fighting the disease of delay wherever it appeared, with spanners, wire, and uncompromising hand signals. At the edge of Paris, where La Coupe marked the forward limit of the arterial push, the road's magic dissolved back into the messy reality of war. Dumps took in the flow and rebreathed it toward the front in smaller convoys, mule trains of trucks peeling off down secondary roads, their orders chalked onto windshields, their loads matched to units with only a little luck and a lot of practice. Then the empty trucks turned, found the return leg of the loop, and were swallowed again by the rule that had saved the pursuit from itself: one way, spaced, steady, unglamorous, unstoppable. It was not elegant, but it worked. The road had been taught to obey. They called for drivers, and the army answered with men who had been bakers yesterday, clerks the week before, and radio operators before that. Orders sliced through the line. Any soldier not bound to a critical duty would climb behind a wheel. The ranks of the Red Ball swelled with these reassigned hands until the convoys became a school on wheels. In this new classroom, the douze and a half was the textbook and a long French night the exam. 3 out of 4 drivers who took those seats were African American. It was not an accident of enthusiasm but a policy of the time, the segregated army, where black soldiers were herded toward service and support units even as they had served in every American war. The Red Ball opened a narrow door in that wall. It was not combat in the classic sense, but it was proximity to the front, and it was responsibility that mattered. Many had never driven before the war, certainly not 5 tons of steel laden with gasoline and ammunition down a road that did not forgive mistakes. They learned in hours what peacetime drivers learn in months: how to feel a clutch through boot soles, how to double clutch by ear, how to nurse a bulky carburetor back into line as if soothing a sick animal. Their education came with no mercy and immediate consequences, but they adapted with a speed born of necessity and pride. Training tended to be a cot, a tarpaulin, a chalkboard, a grizzled sergeant, and a truck with the hood up. The lessons were simple and absolute. This is oil by touch when you cannot risk a light, this is the sound of a bearing beginning to complain, this is the distance, 60 feet, you will keep in the dark, and the tiny green, cat eyes, you will not lose sight of under any circumstance. A convoy is a promise in line form. Do not break it. Urgency gave the lessons their teeth. The Transportation Corps had run the numbers until they were a litany in every briefing. An American infantry division required on the order of 150 tons of gasoline per day during movement, an armored division, roughly 350 tons. Those are not numbers to make a man gasp until he imagines them as jerrycans in a truck bed and counts the trips his unit would have to make before midnight to meet that appetite. The Red Ball's unofficial motto, borrowed from the French, became a shared heartbeat: tout de suite, immediately. Not soon. Not when convenient. Now. John O'Leary of the 3628th Truck Company said it in the kind of sentence that outlives its speaker: Patton wanted us to eat, sleep, and drive, but mostly drive. Men repeated it with a grin that wasn't entirely a joke as they swallowed coffee so strong it tasted like burnt rope and crawled back into cabs that had become both workplace and home. A driver's world shrank to the width of the windshield and the rhythm of the engine. Eat. Sleep. Drive. Repeat. Segregation rode with them even as they sustained the fight. Mess lines divided by skin, barracks that were not to be shared, promotions that bent away from deserving men because of a color line that pretended to be policy. Yet on the road, competence spoke louder than prejudice. A convoy commander who had watched a black driver thread 5 tons through a miles-long choke point in blackout conditions did not need a lecture about ability, he had seen proof in motion. And in many French towns, black GIs found the air easier to breathe. People waved without counting who they waved to. A baker slipped an extra loaf into a canvas bag with a nod. A child asked for a button and got one, wide-eyed at the sudden magic of being noticed. It did not erase what waited back home, but it mattered in the night before the next run. Letters home carried a careful balance: reassurance for mothers, coded pride for fathers, humor for friends who could understand the joke under the joke. Learning fast, one might write, roads here are like sewing threads and we're the needle. Another, more tired, they say tout de suite a lot here. We say it, too. Censor stamps punched holes in paragraphs that strayed too close to routes, tonnage, places. The marrow of the message still got through. We're moving. We matter. We're careful. Pray for tires. In the cabs, pairs formed that would be spoken of years later as if they'd been marriages: the steady man and the quick one, the joker and the planner, the old hand and the green kid who learned in one hard week because his partner taught him and the road punished every mistake gently the first time and not at all the second. They invented rules that weren't written anywhere. The thermos rides in the door pocket with the opening turned away from the wind. The wrench goes under the seat where your right hand finds it without fumbling. Tape the flashlight lens and keep it in your breast pocket. When you need it, you will need it now. Talk little at night, let the engine noise fill the gaps. Racism did not take a holiday when bullets flew. There were still commanders who sent black drivers into suspect areas first, as if risk could be bled away down a particular line. There were still slurs overheard in the wrong mess tent. But there was also the stubborn fact of performance. The more runs made, the more loads delivered, the more engines coaxed through another night, the harder it became to pretend that the Red Ball's engine ran on anything but skill and nerve. That truth had a way of making itself heard even in places where truth was not welcome. It would be remembered later, folded into the larger story of a country that had asked for everything from men it would not seat at the same table, then watched those men give everything anyway. Drivers learned the art of pacing a convoy so it breathed instead of gasped, steady throttle, no showboating, no heroics except the kind that involved patience. They kept distance like a creed, 60 feet, 60 feet, so the accordion did not crush them when a hill slowed the head of the column. They tuned their ears to the sending of signals the rules prohibited. The slight flicker of brake lights meant something ahead, the barely audible change in pitch from the truck in front meant a grade coming up, and the pale, sweeping rise of a hedgerow line meant a bend that would throw off any fool who tried to pass. The work had a particular psychology. You drove toward gunfire and away from it in the same shift, and sometimes the noise lived in you afterward with a persistence the doctors would later give a name. You came to love the cab's small rituals because they were control in a world that offered little, the way your hand found the shifter from neutral without looking, the way your boot toe tapped the dash in the same place every time, the way you set your helmet on the seat when you could so your neck could unknot for 5 minutes. You remembered the trucks that had been lost, the one that burned bright and sudden when a tracer found a leak, the one that skidded into a ditch when a front tire blew with a sound like a drum hit hard in a marching band. And you remembered who had been driving. Names hung in the air like mile markers no map showed. When the convoy stopped at a forward dump, the transformation from drivers to laborers happened with the ease of practiced motion. Tailgates dropped. Hands formed a chain. Jerrycans passed and passed, fingers numbed by cold and the weight of steel, the rhythm as hypnotic as a hymnal. The smell of gasoline clung to hair and sleeves and rode back with them, a sweet chemical ghost. Then the trucks were lighter, the road home a little kinder, the promise ahead renewed, the fuel would be there when tank crews reached for their caps and armored columns turned the key the next morning. In quiet hours that were never quite long enough, men compared tips with the intensity of artisans. A quarter turn on this screw when the air gets wet after midnight. Pull the governor on the hill and put it back before morning inspection if you value your stripes. Listen, at 25 miles per hour the engine hum aligns with the tire's song, ride that harmony and you'll use less fuel. It was folklore, science, and superstition braided into something that looked very much like mastery. If anyone asked them what they were doing beyond driving, they could have said they were buying time with miles. Every jerrycan in a truck bed was a small slice of tomorrow paid for in fatigue, stubbornness, and the acceptance of risk. They were, in the strictest sense, extending the reach of the Army's arm every hour they kept the line intact. In the looser, truer sense, they were proving that a segregated army could not segregate talent from consequence forever. The road recognized competence with a fairness the world often refused. It did not care who you were so long as you kept the promise of motion. So they ate, they slept where and when they could, and they drove. They said tout de suite with a smile that had earned the right to it. They made a new kind of soldierly pride out of the unglamorous work of sustaining everything glamorous. And when the cat eyes winked on and the convoy rolled, they settled into the rhythm that made the red ball more than a set of orders. It was a calling with a steering wheel. At the height of the chase, the Red Ball Express ran like a river in flood, filling its banks, polishing its stones, reshaping the land it crossed. In the first 5 days it found its rhythm and then dared to keep it. What began with 67 truck companies surged until, by August 29, roughly 132 companies and nearly 6,000 vehicles were on the road, a moving city of engines and canvas that hauled 12,342 tons to forward depots in a single day, a record that would stand unmatched for the next 14 weeks. Those numbers had a physical sound, a low continuous thunder like far-off surf, punctuated by gears changing in unison as columns crested hills and rolled down the far side, each truck holding its place like a bead on a taut wire. The route lengthened as the front leaped the Seine and swept past Paris. New legs pushed east beyond the old limits, and the ban on civilian and unrelated military traffic became a commandment. Military police enforced it with an almost priestly severity, turning back vans, carts, even staff cars that swaggered until they met the white glove and the red circle. The convoys owned the corridor now. A lead jeep wearing its blue pennant carved the path, a green-flagged cleanup jeep at the tail carried chains, tools, and a promise that no broken rig would be allowed to clog the artery. Between them, trucks ran numbered and steady, their chalked positions a simple insurance against confusion when darkness or weather tried to erase order. The rules were the same, but the drivers learned to bend the world between the lines. Mechanics leaned over the Jimmy's carburetors with the tenderness of watchmakers, nudging fuel mixtures until the engines ran a shade hotter, a shade stronger. Governors, those little tyrants that capped speed and tamed power, found themselves quietly removed for the long uphill pulls and just as quietly reinstalled before inspection. There were no points for style, only for distance. If a truck could be persuaded to keep 27 instead of 25 on the flat without showing it, the extra minutes compounded like interest, paying out at the forward dump where a tank's crew would meet dawn with a full load. Convoys perfected their own language. Daylight hand signals were crisp, a circling finger to spread the interval, a flat palm slicing down for slow, a stiff arm stabbing left to show a break ahead. At night, horns were still forbidden except in emergency, but sound traveled in other ways. Drivers learned to listen to the faint, telling changes, the tiny pitch climb that meant the truck ahead had shifted down, the tap-tap from a loose strap that warned of a shifting load. On long grades, a convoy's survival depended on momentum. Veterans taught rookies the art of the rolling start, keep the line moving at a walking pace while the lead truck nosed onto the slope, then let each driver feed and throttle and clutch in a smooth, practiced sequence so no one stalled and no gearboxes died in a frenzy of grinding. A perfect rolling start was triumph measured in silence, no horn, no lurch, just the column climbing like a patient animal. At the center of it all, the arithmetic of victory grew sharper. Every truck on the Red Ball route was one less truck somewhere else, and the theater's great argument, broad front versus narrow thrust, echoed in the depots as loudly as in command tents. North, the British and Canadians eyed a bold strike into the Low Countries. East, Bradley's 12th Army Group pressed to keep pressure along a wide front, Patton pushed to drive his armor like a spearhead into Lorraine and beyond. Allocations of fuel and transport shifted with the politics of priority. Drivers joked that they could tell who was winning the argument by which dump filled first at night, but the joke had an edge. A day's worth of Red Ball tonnage could tip an operation from possible to real. When a new airborne N-armor gamble upstream demanded trucks and gasoline in September, the Red Ball's planners felt the tug immediately, and still the columns rolled, parceled, and fed the line so the pursuit did not turn to puddles of stalled steel. The roads themselves bore the marks of the experiment. Dust hung in pale curtains by afternoon and turned to paste under early autumn rain, making ruts that swallowed careless wheels. Drivers learned to sit forward when the surface began to whisper and to ease off the throttle before a bend so the truck's center of gravity didn't lean into disaster. Where villages pinched the route, the convoys flexed into single file, and MPs held cross streets like bartenders keeping a rowdy room in line. French families came to know the timing, how the first trucks passed before breakfast and the last after midnight, and learned to step back with baskets held close as the living conveyor belt flowed past. The Red Ball wasn't just a plan, it was a presence, a recurring tide that carved its channel deeper every day. At forward depots, the choreography tightened to a ritual. Led jeeps veered into marked lanes, and the column followed like a zipper closing. Tailgates dropped in one motion, and hands made a chain. Ammunition crates went one way, rations another, jerrycans everywhere at once. The convoy commander, eyes on a clipboard, ear on a clock, measured turnarounds in minutes and swore softly when a truck's idle changed pitch, a mechanic's ear catching a misfire that could turn a fast unload into an hour lost under a lifted hood. Then the column was light and moving again, back toward the beaches and dumps that had bent their nights around the certainty that the trucks would return hungry for more. The system worked because it never allowed itself a full stop. The red ball drove like a heart, systole, diastole, forward heavy, back empty, over and over until the ports and rails could take the strain. Where followed speed like a shadow. A driver could feel bolts loosening not as rattle but as a faint, wrong hum through the floorboard. Tires took a beating that defied pity. A small detachment at each control point huffed air into sidewalls and listened for the whisper of a slow leak. Radiators simmered in late summer heat, and drivers popped hoods the instant the halt command came, standing back from the breath of steam that rose like a ghost before the cap could be cracked. None of this was heroism in the grand sense, it was craft and attention, the discipline that keeps a machine from eating itself when asked to do a little more, then a little more again. Discipline was also the fence around temptation. Speed wanted to creep up on the flats, drivers wanted to nose around the truck ahead to see what lay beyond the next bend. The rules said no, and MPs backed the rules with citations, shouted warnings, and, when needed, the kind of dressing down that takes the shine off pride. The convoy did not belong to any one driver. It belonged to the mission, and the mission cared nothing for bravado. But within those limits, ingenuity earned quiet applause. A driver who learned to read the road by the way hedgerow shadows fell under cloud could shave seconds without shame, a mechanic who could retune a fussy carburetor in the time it took to pass 3 jerrycans forward was a minor saint. Stories traveled the route as quickly as trucks. Someone swore he'd seen a column hit a stretch of new macadam and speed pick up until the trucks hummed like bees, governors off and no MP in sight, only to have the lead jeep tap its brake twice, a gentle reminder that the game had rules. Another told of a bridge where the engineer in charge stood with a chalk stick, marking a tally on the railing for each truck and muttering load classes like prayers, his eyes daring anyone to defy the painted circle that said how many tons the span would bear. At night, drivers swore the cat eyes on the truck ahead could smile when a grade eased and frown when it steepened, a small superstition that made the darkness friendlier. Even as the machine reached its peak, the men inside it kept their world small on purpose. Watch the lights. Listen to the engine. Eat when you can, sleep when you must, and never, ever lose sight of your place in the line. The scale of it, the thousands of vehicles, the tens of thousands of tons, was someone else's understanding. For the driver in the seat, the war narrowed to a few rules and a handful of habits that kept him safe and kept the promise he had made by taking the wheel, deliver, return, repeat. And so the Red Ball Express ran full throttle without ever seeming to hurry, bending physics where it could and obeying it where it must. It flowed farther east, carried more than it had been designed to carry, and kept its balance while commanders far above argued over where the next gallon should go. If there was art in it, it was the art of knowing when to push and when to hold steady, when to pull the governor and when to put it back, when to trust momentum and when to set the brake. The balance held, and with it the pursuit. Speed charged a brutal interest. The first bills came due in heat and noise, batteries bleeding down from endless starts, engines running hot enough to turn coolant sweet and metallic, motors cooking bearings because grease schedules had become a luxury no one could afford. Transmissions howled from hurried downshifts, bolts walked loose from 1,000 microshocks, and somewhere in every convoy a driver felt the strange, sick lightness that meant a driveshaft had quit its post and rattled off into the ditch. The jimmies were tough, but even tough breaks under a grind that never lets up. Tires told the story best. In the first month alone, Red Ball trucks ate through 40,000 of them, a number so grotesque it felt like a misprint until you walked a control point and saw the dead rubber piled like driftwood. Retread shops sprang up like field chapels, blessed by the smell of hot vulcanizing and the hiss of air knives, sending patched casings back onto rims with prayers stapled to them. Mechanics joked that what rolled out was more glue than tire, but the joke ended when a sidewall held through another 100 miles of ruts and stones. On good days, a truck came in on canvas showing, left on black rubber, and blended back into the line before the coffee in its cab had cooled. The system's motto hardened into gallows humor. Red ball trucks break, but don't break. It was a line that drew a smile until you lived the way it carved decisions. A fan belt starting to fray? Note it, adjust tension, push on. A bearing singing in the key of future failure? Mark the hood, plan a quick swap at the next grease point, keep distance, keep speed. The commandments were simple: do not stop the line, do not let one truck become a cork in the artery, do not mistake caution for safety when the greater danger is delay. A cleanup jeep existed for a reason. If a rig died, chains clinked, a boom swung, and the body was yanked clear before the clot could form. The truck staggered under loads that would have made a safety officer faint. Ammunition crates climbed in tight, teetering walls that surpassed the canvas tops, jerrycans were nested in every spare corner. Fred Reese, a mechanic out of a European theater ambulance unit, remembered the sight with a mix of awe and dread. Oh boy, do I remember that Red Ball gang. They were a hell of a crew. They used to carry ammunition boxes twice as high as the top of the truck, and when they went down the highway they swayed back and forth. They had no fear. Those guys were crazy, like they were getting paid for every run. A certain madness had a logic to it. Tonnage moved the war, caution starved it. Drivers learned to feel the sway and ride it, hips and hands making micro-corrections that turned top-heavy into merely dangerous. Fatigue coiled around everything like wire. Crews traded the wheel the way firemen pass a nozzle, deliberate, practiced, without drama, so that one pair of eyes could close for 20 minutes while the other stared into the cat-eyed dusk. Sleep was something you grabbed with both hands, a slump against a door, a folded jacket under your cheek on the steering wheel, an open mouth drawing diesel-laced air while the truck idled. Night chow came hot if you were lucky, warm if you were blessed, cold and fast if the line had pressed you thin through the afternoon. Men ate leaning against bumpers, balanced on fenders, cups of coffee cupped like contraband against the wind. The road offered no mercy. Rains came and wrote their own orders into the mud. Dust that had hung all August like pale veils turned to paste, grabbed at tires, and dragged trucks sideways with the lazy insistence of a river. Headlights stayed dark, the cat eyes were enough and all they were allowed, 2 green slits that told a man where not to die. Drivers learned to read the night, how a hedgerow's shadow deepened where a ditch waited, how a barn's silhouette meant a curve, how the smell of a village preceded its dark bulk in the road. Stray light, a cigarette, a careless match, drew curses and sometimes worse. Men learned to smoke cupping the ember like a secret, exhale slow, and hide the brief glow under a collar. They passed through landscapes that looked like memories refusing to fade. Bombed-out villages stood as stacks of rooms peeled open to the sky, furniture asking questions no one had time to answer. Fields held the black shapes of dead cattle, fences leaned inward as if listening to the low thunder of the convoys for instructions. The charred husks of vehicles, some German, some American, squatted in ditches with a stubborn permanence. Drivers stared straight ahead and noticed everything anyway. The mind records what the mouth refuses to repeat. When the trucks rolled into parks and motor pools at dawn, men spoke of clutches and carburetors, not the shape that lay near the culvert at kilometer 6. Maintenance became triage and art. Under blackout, a mechanic slid under a truck with a wrench and a feel for threads he couldn't see. A carburetor came apart on a fender, pieces laid out in a tactile order the hands knew by habit. A wrecker crew fished a crippled rig from a ditch with chains that sang when they took the strain. Salvage roamed the verges like crows, stripping a wreck fast and clean, a good tire here, a still honest battery there, a headlight assembly more valuable as a spare than as a museum piece. Cannibalization sounded ugly and was beautiful when it meant one running truck where there had been 2 that could only limp. Rules bent and held. The 25-mile-per-hour cap saved lives and bridges, and yet there were stretches where engines, tuned just so, whispered an invitation to 27 or 28. The governor, mechanical conscience, came off on hills and went back on at the next halt because badges and stripes were hard-won and easily lost. An MP's whistle could peel paint, and the white glove cut the air like law. But MPs also learned the faces, knew who could be trusted to keep a column smooth, and allowed a good man a human inch that bought the mission an extra mile. Pain had its own tempo. A hand slid on a wet jerrycan handle and split skin, the sting met gasoline and turned into a small, private halo of fire. Fingernails went black under hammered thumbs and grew out months later, reminding their owners of some midnight repair. People wrapped tape around palms, around flashlight lenses, around the part of themselves that needed one more layer between them and the world. A medic truck drifted along the loop like a ghost, and when it stopped for more than a minute, everyone felt the road hold its breath. And still the loads mattered more than the cost of carrying them. Every crate of rations was warmth in a foxhole tomorrow. Every box of bandages was a wound that wouldn't turn to rot. Every shell was a barrage that would force a river line and let the column roll another dozen miles. Drivers did the math in ways that made sense to drivers. This run equals that platoon's hot meal. This load equals that battalion's push at dawn. The calculus lent itself to stubbornness. When a gasket blew a slick of oil onto the road, a driver nursed the engine the last 3 miles not because a rule said he must, but because he could see the men who would be waiting under the grove of trees where the dump began. The cost leaked into the trucks themselves. Dashboards picked up rosaries, ribbons, small saints, lucky coins, a rabbit's foot faded to gray. Names got chalked onto fenders and doors, rubbed off by rain and repainted by somebody who liked the joke. The lead jeep's blue pennant frayed into threads that snapped in crosswinds, the green flag at the tail was replaced twice in a week by a corporal who treated it like a regimental color. Small rituals took on meaning. A knock on wood before a bridge, a finger tapped twice on the dash for a lost friend when the convoy passed the place where his truck had burned. By the end of that furious first month, the Red Ball Express wore its fatigue like a medal and hid it like a secret. The artery was still open, the patient still strong, the pulse steady. To keep it that way, men made 1,000 tiny trades with fate, a skipped inspection here to make a window there, a risk accepted because the alternative was failure measured in cold, hard miles. The road demanded more than rubber and steel. It took nerve and craft, and it paid them back in the single currency that mattered, motion. So they kept moving, even when the trucks broke. They did not break unless the mission said so. And the war, that great, grinding machine, fed on their momentum and asked for more. Danger stalked the convoys in ways that maps could not mark. The roads were thin seams stitched through a country that had not finished fighting. Shoulders hid more than ditches, they hid teller mines set by retreating engineers, and a driver learned to keep to the crown not out of neatness but survival. The rule felt superstitious until you saw a truck sink at the edge as if a giant finger had pressed down on its hood. In Belgium, Rudolf Kohler rode with a line of trucks that had become too comfortable with the rhythm of their own motion. The first warning was not a blast but a sensation, the wrong kind of silence before the road shook and an 88mm shell tore the lead truck open like a can. The second shell hit the next rig in line, and the convoy stopped because shock is a break all its own. The driver's fear was honest and intelligent. They made a hard bargain with their captain, "We will go on if you take point in your jeep." He did, and he did not bluff it. He walked the road, read the ground with a practiced eye, and found a safer way around a death letter written in German artillery math. Threats shifted with the terrain. In hedgerow country, an ambush could be a pair of machine guns stitched into a green wall. In open fields, artillery reached out in arcs that only a forward observer fully understood. Where the route pinched through a village, the hazard became a corner that forced a truck to slow just long enough for someone with a rifle in an upstairs window to feel bold. Convoys learned habits that looked like quirks from the outside and like wisdom from the cab. Avoid the shoulder. Keep the middle. Roll through intersections as if the air were heavy there. Stop nowhere you have not chosen. The sky was not neutral. Even with their strength bled away, the Luftwaffe's fighters prowled for prey that could not shoot back with anything more intimidating than a .50 caliber on a ring mount. When the fighters came down, they came fast, Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts flashing low enough that you could read the sawtooth edge of the camo and the black crosses like a dare. A truck's M2HB could spit back, and some gunners swore they saw tracers stitch a wing root and spark, but the mismatch was plain. The best defense was dispersion and darkness. Drivers killed lights, hugged the hedgerow shadows, and waded flat to the earth as bullets chewed canvas and hammered metal. Then they did the math the red ball had taught them: assess, rejoin, move. Lieutenant Charles Wiko knew that dance. He had mistaken gunfire for stones once and never again. The sound a fighter makes when it dives on you becomes a knowledge you cannot unlearn. Black drivers bore a disproportionate share of risk not because roads made choices but because orders did. When a sector turned suspect, rumors of raiders, of stragglers with Panzerfausts in barn stalls, some commanders sent the black companies first. It was policy's shadow falling across the road, and men felt it without needing to name it. They went anyway because the load mattered and because their word to each other mattered more than a fair world that had not yet arrived. The unfairness did not blunt their craft. In some towns, French FFI guides and armbands waved them off the obvious route with urgency and led them down lanes that smelled of apples and manure to a safer bridge the maps did not show. The drivers learned to trust those hands when they pointed like weather vanes that could sense a storm before the leaves moved. Minds gave themselves away if you knew what to see. A patch of earth that had been tamped too carefully, grass with the wrong sheen, a shallow scrape on a stone where a crate had been dragged. The lead jeep's job became something between scouting and sermonizing: watch me, follow me, and do not invent your own faith. When a mine went off, it went with a flat, brutal note that left no room for confusion. The training that had seemed abstract in a tent under safe light snapped into purpose. A man stayed where he fell if he could speak. His buddies came when the cleanup jeep signaled, not before, because a good heart could set off a second charge as easily as a careless foot. The enemy could be friendly by mistake. Blackout discipline saved lives and invited other kinds of danger. A convoy that moved like a shadow could slide too close to American pickets jittery from shelling. Passwords mattered, and MPs worked to keep civilians out not only to protect the convoys but to prevent a farmer's cart from becoming a panic-struck trigger for someone who had been awake too long. Papers were checked, armbands were noted, and there were nights when a word spoken in the wrong accent at a checkpoint made everyone's fingers tighten. The road was a vein that ran through an army's body. Infection by rumor or infiltrator could clot it as surely as shrapnel. First aid became a reflex you did not advertise. A kit rode under every seat: bandage rolls, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes. A driver who caught a splinter of glass across his brow learned to wrap it one-handed while his partner kept them in line, eyes fixed on the cat eyes ahead. A man who took a round through the calf was pulled into a ditch and his tourniquet set in the dark. The convoy's tail would carry him to a clearing station as if the road itself had turned into a stretcher. No one raised alarms unless the column's life demanded it. Noise drew attention, and attention was already too plentiful. MPs built roadblocks at night that looked, to a tired driver, like barriers to be argued with. They were not. A flashlight hooded to a coin-sized glow, a hand up, a quick exchange: where from, where to, who is in charge of your column? In the early weeks, discipline clashed with impatience. By September, the system had taught both to share the road. The white glove did not yield, and the driver who learned its rhythm kept his place in the world and his truck on its wheels. When rumors spread of Germans wearing captured uniforms to confuse and slow, MPs tightened their circle, tested challenge and reply harder, and the convoys bowed through the narrowed gate with the annoyance of the righteous and the gratitude of the living. Local knowledge could cheat death. A baker knew which bridge had been wired and never blown, which field held a sump that would swallow an axle. A priest had heard boots in the churchyard at an hour when only ghosts should walk, and told an MP who told a convoy commander who shifted a route 2 blocks and saved a green driver from a corner that would have killed him. Stories of such saves traveled the loop in coffee steam and cigarette smoke, lifting morale more honestly than any poster. The quiet mathematics of risk and courage lived in the cab. A driver weighed the rumble in a wheel bearing against the certainty that a battalion needed this load now. He weighed the bright temptation of passing a slower truck against the knowledge that the curve ahead could be mining country. He learned to trust the convoy, to let it carry him the way a river carries a leaf that is smart enough not to fight the current. The bravest thing, often, was to be exact. Keep the interval. Obey the bridge sign. Follow the blue flag and trust the green one to fix what breaks. When the Luftwaffe came late and angry, the longest seconds were not the strafing run but the pause after, when ears rang and a man's body wanted to run in all directions at once. The second pass was always the worst one because it had time to be imagined. The discipline to stay low, to hold still, to only move when the convoy moved, that was a kind of courage that doesn't earn a medal but feeds a victory. Unequal risk did not mean unequal merit. Black drivers, sent first into doubt too often, returned with their trucks and their loads, adding proof upon proof that a segregated policy could not define the quality of their service. Their names threaded through after-action reports and mechanic logs more than they threaded through citation lists, but their work had a way of gathering witnesses. A convoy commander who watched a black driver back a loaded deuce-and-a-half down a blind lane under fire without stalling did not forget it. An engineer who saw a black wrecker crew lift a dead truck from a bridge in under 5 minutes because the span was creaking did not forget it. The road remembered who kept it flowing, even when the paperwork did not. As autumn deepened, the convoys moved under skies that came later and went earlier. The dangers did not fade, they changed costume. Mines crept closer to the main routes. Strafing raids came at odd hours, hunting the gaps. Checkpoints grew stricter because rumor said the enemy was learning the road's habits. The Red Ball Express answered not with heroics but with more of what had saved it from the first: order, craft, courage measured in seconds and inches. They kept to the middle. They watched the hedgerows. They trusted the flags. And when the road asked a price, they paid it and drove on, because tomorrow waited downrange and someone had to deliver it. By autumn's turn, the map changed color. German formations were shoved out of most of France and the Low Countries, and the seams that had once defined a desperate chase began to look like established lines. The big mouths of Europe, ports that could swallow a continent's worth of cargo, started breathing again. Antwerp, captured in early September, waited on a harder task, clearing the Scheldt estuary. Mines, guns, and water made a single obstacle that could not be bullied, only bled and solved. When it was finally opened, and when French railways thumped back to life under the hammer of engineers and repair crews, something profound shifted. The long, improvised artery of the Red Ball Express could begin to relax. Not stop, never stop suddenly, but ease its grip and let steel rails and deep-water docks take back the burden they were built to bear. By November 1944, the decision was official. The Red Ball Express, that emergency heart-lung machine, shut down as a named operation. The roads it had taught to obey returned to a Messier traffic, the red circle signs came down or weathered into ghosts on stone and bark, and the convoys that had once owned the route folded back into the wider war's machinery. It felt like an ending because it was, but only of the chapter that had saved the pursuit's momentum. The story had one more trial to pass. On December 16, Adolf Hitler hurled his last throw of the dice in the West. Through the thick forests of the Ardennes, German armor and infantry punched into thin American lines under a sky the enemy had prayed for, low, gray, grounding Allied air power. The attack's shape on situation maps bulged like a bruise, a wedge driven into the Allied front so deep that commanders would give the battle its name from the map itself. What the Germans counted on was surprise, weather, and American logistics stretched thin. What they ran into, quietly, stubbornly, were the consequences of months of movement made possible by the Red Ball Express. Forward supply dumps, pre-stocked by the endless labor of drivers and depot troops, turned into the difference between holding and falling back. Units caught in the path of the advance found not empty racks but fuel, ammunition, and winter stores stacked under canvas, enough to turn a rout into a brace and a brace into a stand. The same network that had taught traffic to flow one way became a net that could also pull things backward in a hurry. It mattered because fuel was a double-edged prize. American columns needed it to maneuver, but German tanks needed it even more desperately to exploit any breakthrough. Red Ball veterans and the Transportation Corps did something as vital as any delivery. They evacuated thousands of gallons from forward areas before the enemy could seize it, denying life to steel that was already short of breath. Orders cracked like whips. Eisenhower directed the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions to converge on Bastogne, the crossroads town that suddenly mattered more than its size. The road network answered with the only reply it had ever given: motion. Trucks that had carried jerrycans and rations now hauled men by the thousands, airborne troops in greatcoats and jump boots standing shoulder to shoulder in the beds, faces set against the cold, rifles held upright like saplings in a winter grove. MPs opened corridors through Belgium with their white gloves and their implacable palms. Engineers cleared snow and shored bridges. The same choreography that had fed Patton's tanks now fed the defense, and then the counterstroke. The system proved itself not just strong, but flexible, able to switch from long-haul pursuit to emergency reinforcement without tearing. The praise from the top had already been spoken, but it gained new weight in December's dark. In October, Dwight D. Eisenhower had sent a message to the Red Ball ranks that was as plain as it was sincere: to the drivers, mechanics, and officers who kept the vehicles moving, you are doing an excellent job. Coming from a supreme commander who had watched the summer turn on tonnage and nerve, the words felt like more than courtesy. They were acknowledgement that wars are decided not only at the point of contact but in the space that makes contact possible. After the bulge, the Red Ball Express did not come roaring back under its old name. It didn't need to. Ports were in full voice, rails clattered, the great logistics machine matured into the kind of strength that doesn't demand drama to prove itself. The convoys faded from the forward gossip of foxholes and motor pools, and yet their myth did not fade at the same pace. The secrecy that had once surrounded routes and schedules, the strictness with which MPs and commanders had protected the arteries, left a lingering sense among drivers who arrived later that some part of their mission was still special, still behind a curtain. Welby Franz, who took command of a trucking company after the Red Ball's official end, put it in a sentence that became a shrug and a truth: that's what we were all told. When the ledger closed, the numbers were both simple and staggering. Scheduled at birth to live 2 weeks, the Red Ball Express ran 82 days. In that span it delivered more than 400,000 tons, gasoline, oil, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, everything a modern army eats and excretes as it moves. The figure is large enough to be abstract until you remember how it was composed: one truck, one load, one driver's decision repeated until it added up to a continent crossed. Much of that tonnage rode in trucks driven by African American soldiers who, by policy and prejudice, had been steered into service roles and kept away from the places where medals were usually minted. The road did not respect that line. It judged competence hour by hour, mile by mile, and the men who bore the unequal risk made an equal, indispensable contribution. They endured slights and segregation in mess tents and billets even as their work kept the front from starving. Their recognition lagged their achievement, as it so often did, but a thing can be true before it is celebrated. The Red Ball Express belongs to them as surely as to any name higher on a chart. Legacies are often claimed by those who write doctrine, and here, too, the Red Ball left fingerprints. It taught planners to think in flows and protected corridors, to map not just where divisions would go but how fuel would arrive in the hour it was needed. It proved that a road network could be made to behave like a railroad if you gave it rules, guardians, and respect. It showed that improvisation at scale, held together by discipline rather than elegance, can carry a campaign across the gap between plan and possibility. In quieter ways, it also fed a future in which the men who kept it running would ask their country to remember what they had already proven about their skill and their right to stand as equals. Years later, a son of the Supreme Commander, himself a veteran of that theater and a historian of that war, gave the drivers a sentence they had earned on the road: the spectacular nature of the advance through France was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks. Without it the advance across France could not have been made. You can read it as flattery if you prefer. Or you can hear in it the sound the drivers knew best, engines working together, steady, necessary, singing the song of a victory that would not have existed without them. The red circles are gone now, their paint weathered away. The hedgerows have grown and been cut again, the bridges have been rebuilt, the villages mended. But if you stand on a certain road under a grey French sky and listen hard enough, you might still hear it, the murmur of 1,000 trucks, the faint jingle of tools in a clean-up jeep, the quiet oath of a driver easing a heavy load through a narrow place. That is the sound of an army's backbone, remembered in motion.